great to have you here again. Thanks so much for joining us. Before we actually dive into any of your work with Wikipedia, we'd love to talk a little bit about your background. Just want to hear about your upbringing, how it potentially shaped some of your core values today in your professional career and personal life, and maybe some of the biggest lessons you learned growing up that you still carry with you in your daily life and in your work today.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's a whole set of things. But so I grew up in Huntsville, Alabama, which Alabama in particular is not much known for being high tech, but Huntsville is where NASA located the space program. So people know about Houston and Cape Kennedy, but Huntsville is where the rocket scientists were. So when I was a child growing up, we had Werner von Braun and all of the rocket scientists, and they would actually test the rockets close enough to where I lived that the windows would rattle in the house. So it was all very exciting that the space program was there in town and the science was going on there. And I think that turned me towards technology, towards science, as a fundamental core value. Also, people in Alabama are very friendly, and I'm very friendly. So I think that also helped me quite a lot in my career, because all of my work has to do with enabling and empowering volunteers, people who are doing things because they're fun, because they're interesting, because they're meaningful. And so, I'm not a person who bosses people around. I want to lead people through persuasion and giving them a big idea and a big vision to work towards. I'm not sure what else, if you have any specific questions, but I went on to university at Auburn University, University of Alabama, and then Indiana University, studying finance, and worked for a while in finance in Chicago in the futures and options business. But then I got really excited about the internet. As the internet began to boom, I saw that this was going to be a fundamentally transformational technology for the world. And I wanted to do that, wanted to be involved in that. What I always say is I'm very fortunate to have become successful because I basically just get up every day and try to do the most interesting thing I can think of to do, which doesn't necessarily mean I make a great employee because I follow whatever interests I have at the moment. But that's worked out well for me.
Okay, so
Yes.
talking about college life, there's a lot of delegates who are also college students. So Jimmy, what were some of your biggest takeaways and most impactful experience from your time in your university, or how did this ultimately influence your post-university life?
Yeah, so I mean, I really enjoyed that time of life because, in addition to my coursework, which I found interesting enough, there was also just all the resources of a university to engage me and so forth. So I didn't always perform at the highest level in my coursework. I mean, it wasn't a disaster, but because, as I say, I'm a person who follows my passions and my interests. And so I spent an enormous amount of time, in the university years learning about the internet, which actually had nothing to do with my degree, learning about technology and programming and so on and so forth, and reading philosophy and ideas and history of science and so forth. So I think in many ways, it's a wonderful time of life if you treat it not just as a simple, straightforward training program, but as a time of life to grow and to learn and to actually expand your mind in a million different ways.
Did you meet any mentors or professors in the college and who would impact you for the years to come?
Yeah, I mean, several different ones. I never, I wouldn't, I never really sought out a mentor, like as in one person to guide me, but I had a lot of professors who did have an enormous impact on me. I think at Harvard you'll have a lot more famous professors. you know, who you know, they are impressive world-leading intellectuals. I had some fantastic professors, but no one really famous. So nothing to call out really.
Yeah, very, very cool to hear about your college life and how you explored things different from finance, or this idea of exploring what you find interesting in the day. I guess we will definitely continue talking about that with you throughout the rest of this conversation. And also very interesting to hear that, or I also knew this beforehand, but that you attended IU. I personally am from Indiana myself, so always nice to hear the name of Indiana around. Yes, but
Yes.
yeah, any advice you would give? So a lot of our delegates in the audience today are young individuals, some of them fresh out of college, some of them still in college. Is there any advice you would give any of them, or advice you would give your 22 or 20-year-old self in the middle of college while exploring your different interests and having trouble navigating what you're interested in?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a few things I would say, and I mainly speak to entrepreneurship and doing something, starting something. And you know what I would say to people is just go for it, just do it, because there's a real mistake that you can make if you're always thinking and planning. A lot of people have a funny idea about entrepreneurship. So the model that people have in their minds for entrepreneurship would be sort of Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg, where you, I don't know, drop out of Harvard and have one brilliant idea and it goes straight to the moon and you become one of the richest people in the world. But that's not normal. Like that's not how most entrepreneurship is. Entrepreneurship is really an ongoing process, trying and failing. And the truth is, if you paralyze yourself thinking, is this idea big enough to make me the richest person in the world? That's paralyzing, right? Instead, you've got to try and fail. You've got to, do different things. And, one of the great things about the culture of Silicon Valley is that trying and failing is not a bad thing. It's much better than not even trying. And so, in that culture, you can, go out and start a small thing, work on it, learn, grow as a person. And if it doesn't work out, hey, that's fine. At least you did something and it was interesting. And you probably learned more from that than you would have sort of sitting in a very safe job at a bank or something like that. And so I think that's part of my advice is, you don't have to wait for the perfect idea or the perfect business plan. Better to just get started. I mean, one of the great sayings, which I wish I had invented, but I didn't, is fail faster, with the idea of lots of small experiments, actually get products out there, get something in front of people, find out if they like it or they don't like it, find out if they hate it, because you can spend, an eternal amount of time working on some idea only to find out that basically nobody cares. And then that's the other thing is like overcoming the fear of failure. I actually think one of the things to remember is that literally no one cares what you're doing. Like it's nobody's watching. It doesn't matter. Like the if you had a huge spectacular flame out failure that was very famous, that would be a plus in a way. But in fact, when you're young and you're going to go and do something interesting and it doesn't work out, that's fine. Like nobody cares. Nobody's watching. No, it's not going to be a stain on your life forever in the way that it might feel. So yeah, that's my advice.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely agree with a lot of that. And I think many people in the audience can take away a lot from that advice today, especially as they're navigating.
And by the way, I mean, I speak about that really in terms of entrepreneurship, in terms of starting a new organization of some sort. But I think there's a similar principle across the board. Like anything that you might want to do that's a bit outside of the norm or what's expected can feel a bit risky. But you're probably going to be better off having pursued something that you're passionate about, even if it seems a bit risky, than to have not done it at all.
Yes, very true. Yeah, going off of this idea of, I don't know, pursuing sort of the unknown. You mentioned you did some things relating to finance in Chicago for a bit after graduating from college. Very curious to hear about how you actually went into or gained this inspiration and this idea of Wikipedia. I know it started out as Newpedia, but this entire idea of a wiki and what ultimately inspired you to begin pursuing this, what you found interesting about it, things like that.
Yeah, so I grew up in Alabama, and I loved the encyclopedia. So we had a set of encyclopedias, and I read, constantly in the encyclopedia. It was a constant companion in my childhood. So I always had that love for broad general knowledge and the ability to sort of know a little bit about everything and to be able to dig deeper, and to have that really holistic approach to knowledge. So I already was very passionate about the concept of the encyclopedia. And then in the early days of the internet, it seemed in many ways to be it was in the early .com days. There was a lot of pop-up ads and spam and people trying to sell dog food on the internet and so forth. But I think when most people first encountered the internet, like the thing that was really kind of earth-shattering and amazing to people, and it certainly was to me, is that you could communicate ideas with people all around the world. I mean, I remember the first time I had an email from a professor I knew who had it was a Brown University professor who had gone to Australia, and he sent me an email from Australia, and I was like, wow, that's kind of shocking. Like, I've never gotten any communication from Australia. I mean, today that must sound silly, like I'm from the ancient era, but that idea that, oh wow, like we have this incredible tool for sharing knowledge, and yet people seem to be using it for all kinds of nonsense. Actually, why don't we use this tool for sharing knowledge? And so that was one of the real inspirations for Wikipedia, is to say, this is clearly what the internet is ultimately. Knowledge, let's try to understand the universe together. And so that was part of the early inspiration. Of course, with Newpedia, that was the first attempt. I didn't know how to organize it. I didn't really understand online communities, didn't really, it was all kind of new. And so what we did is we created a very traditional top-down model, 7-stage review process to get anything published. And then I knew that it wasn't going to work when I tried to write an article. I was going to write about Robert Merton, who had recently won the Nobel Prize in economics for his work in option pricing theory, which I was, in a way, an expert on that. And when I started to write, it was like very intimidating, because they were going to take my draft and send it to the most prestigious finance professors they could find to agree to review it. And I had been out of academia for a few years, so it was very, it was not fun. It felt like being back in grad school, but with no actual objective other than to publish this free article. And so that was when I realized, hey, this isn't fun. Like, nobody's going to do this. It isn't fun. And we had been going for a couple of years, and we had about 24 entries completed. And so that was when I was like, okay, we really have to make this easier. And so we opened up the wiki, and we had as much work done in 2 weeks as we had in almost 2 years. And I didn't come up with the idea of a wiki. Like the idea of wiki, which means a website anyone can edit, that was invented about 6 years before by a great, lovely programmer, Ward Cunningham. And wikis had been around for a while, but they were not really being used. They were almost like, I always say, it's almost like performance art. In other words, ask yourself the question, what if I put up a website and let anyone edit it? What would it become? And they had certain things like, they didn't keep the history. So actually, if you edited something and you changed it, then the old version was gone forever. So that meant things couldn't slowly improve over time, and you couldn't correct errors in an easy way. It was just constantly temporary, constantly changing. So that was one of the first changes we did, is that, oh no, we actually need to keep the entire history of every article, so that if somebody comes in and damages it, it's one click to fix it. And so, there were a lot of things like that, but it was really a process of learning and exploring, and also always thinking about, how to make this fun for people, but also meaningful. There are a lot of things that are fun but not meaningful. A lot of things that are meaningful but not fun. If you can make both, then you're really onto something.
Yeah, absolutely. It's pretty fascinating to hear you talk about the history of Wikipedia. I think so many of us or we live in such a technologically driven world now that the concept of things like not saving the history and just these initial like technological challenges probably feel very foreign to a lot of people. But really, really fascinating to hear you talk about entire history of how it's created, all the things you talked about. Yeah, I'm very curious to hear if there were any particular challenges you faced as a young entrepreneur early on, whether it was relating to like the technical side of Wikipedia or anything with entrepreneurship, anything like that. Any challenges you faced and lessons you learned as a young entrepreneur that you think really were formative or transformative to your future career?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there were challenges, but I can't remember any of them because I always say I'm a pathological optimist, and I always think everything is fine. So, because of this, challenges never seemed particularly devastating to me. But I mean, more seriously, of course, you can look back and you can say, well, we faced this practical difficulty. Certainly, in the early days of Wikipedia, I would say the project was very successful. The community was very successful. But the WikiMedia Foundation, which is the nonprofit I set up to own and operate Wikipedia, had a lot of growing pains. As a small organization, it really lagged behind the project, and so there was a big challenge in terms of, okay, how do we get the Wikimedia Foundation to be properly functional and a well-run organization and so forth. And I think we've succeeded in that, but it took some time, particularly in the early days when we only had a handful of people. Wikipedia was already world famous, and we had, 3 people working there. So it was very difficult. I remember people emailing saying, "Oh, you should partner with the EU culture or something." I'm like, it's just me here behind my desk. I don't know what you're talking about partnering with the EU. So those were challenges. The growing challenges were quite hard. But I mean, I think the biggest advice I have is exactly what I already said, which is just go for it. Like you can imagine more problems than you'll actually have, and you can't necessarily predict which problems are going to come up until you actually do something. So
Yeah,
Absolutely.
it's so interesting to know all the challenges behind. So after the attempt of the Newpedia, what new developments and ideas do you feel contributed to the Wikipedia success? And what do you think that makes Wikipedia different and stand out from the other competitors?
So I mean, I would say that the biggest thing was in terms of the design of Wikipedia, and I think of it as not just the design of software, but it's like what I would call community design. In other words, what are the rules? What are the norms? What are the expectations? What are the values of the community? And all of that stuff is really incredibly important. And a big part of it has to do with, and this is partly about the software design as well. But if you design around the worst people, and you sort of are constantly on guard to make sure no one does anything bad, you end up in a very bad place, in a very dark place. And a lot of websites are designed this way. They're really designed to make sure that no one can do anything outside the box, whereas Wiki is incredibly open. It's just completely open. And so the idea is to say, look, most people are basically decent, most people are good, and most people just want to help out. But you can't be naive about it. You have to say, okay, but a few people won't be good. And so you can't be silly and say, oh, we won't worry about anything. You have to think about those bad elements, but you don't design around them. You design around the good people. You facilitate good. And if you can, in your design, if you say, look, on balance, good is rewarded and bad is pushed down, then you flourish. And I'm speaking not just of website design or community design in an online sense, but in general in society. We say, look, you wouldn't want to live in a city where you can be thrown in jail for criticizing the mayor. At the same time, you don't want little old ladies to be accosted in the park by hooligans, right? You want to have
Mhm.
that balance between order and civility and rule of
Mhm.
law, but also openness to flourishing, to innovation, to new ideas, to criticism, and so forth. And so that kind of balance is really what a lot of the intellectual work of the Wikipedia community, particularly in the early days, was really thinking through in a really serious way, like how do we preserve this open culture where we're always open to, in a very Enlightenment sense, open to challenge, open to re-examination, open to new ideas, not just about our own work, but about the content of the encyclopedia, while at the same time not sort of saying everything goes and it's completely crazy, wild, free, open space where you can do and say anything you like, because that will never get you anywhere but sort of trolling as a victorious element. And so that's not trivial, right? But it's also in some ways it's also kind of obvious. We already know this from our experiences living in open societies, that you have to think about those kind of balances to get anything done in life.
Right, right. We'll definitely touch on this idea of information accessibility and this idea of openness more a little bit later into the conversation. Very interested to hear a little bit more about how you grasped this idea of balance initially, whether it was balance with how you wanted Wikipedia to interact with the rest of the internet, or how people were able to access Wikipedia, balance within the company, different things like that.
Well, so I mean, for me, I'm a person who very it's just my personality. I would say that
Mm.
I like to chew on ideas. I like to be reflective, thoughtful, not jump to hasty conclusions, but also not refuse to come to conclusions. And so
Mm.
that is very much the way that it's the spirit, I would say, of the Wikipedia community, that we try to respectfully think things through, chew on ideas, have thoughtful discussions and debates, but also to finally make decisions and move on. And that culture is really the culture. It's an Enlightenment culture. It's a proper way of moving forward as human beings. And unfortunately, we see a lot of design of spaces online today that don't foster that kind of a culture. They foster clickbait headlines. They foster just angry sort of debate and sort of soundbite mentality and so on and so forth, rather than an in-depth, thoughtful chewing on ideas with the goal of saying, oh, let's reason together, let's understand the world together.
Mm.
Okay, so talking about the open culture, has your vision for Wikipedia changed throughout your career? And how does Wikipedia's current role in the society compare to what you had expected it to be? Is it different, or there are some changes?
It's almost exactly the same. So almost nothing has changed in terms of what I wanted Wikipedia to become and what it has become. Obviously, a lot of details were to be worked out, but just in terms of the vision, it's pretty much what I had in mind. It's an encyclopedia. It's more comprehensive than a traditional encyclopedia. It's written by volunteers who engage in a long and detailed process of dialogue and debate to get at the truth. And so on those core elements, it's the same, and I think it will stay the same. I mean, we're not going to turn into YouTube. I love YouTube and I love funny cat videos, but that's not what we're about. And we're not TikTok, and we're not, there's lots of things that Wikipedia is not. But what Wikipedia is as an encyclopedia, everyone understands what we're trying to accomplish. And everyone, loves Wikipedia. So I think that stability of vision has always been very important. Now, obviously, if you dig a little deeper, obviously, of course, there's change. There's always change. As technology improves, our editing tools improve, and our, all that kind of stuff. But the philosophical fundamentals, I think, are very, very stable.
Yeah, absolutely. with Wikipedia being very successful and also having, like, as you mentioned earlier, a WikiMedia Foundation and Wikia, how do you ultimately see the WikiMedia Foundation building on this legacy and the work you've already created and initiated with Wikipedia itself?
Yeah, I mean, so the Wikimedia Foundation is now, very, very successful as a nonprofit organization. So we do our annual fundraising, and we're always very, very careful with our money. So we always try to spend a little bit less than we take in to build up our reserves over time. A few years back, we started the Wikimedia Endowment Fund, which is a separate fund, much like a university endowment fund. So it's separate from the annual day-to-day budget, but it's a bigger sort of longer term vision to say, look, let's keep Wikipedia safe for the long run. Make sure that whatever changes happen to technology, whatever things may come down the road, that we're ready and that we have the resources to adapt and to deal with it. I mean, you think about things like, as technology shifts, there are things that definitely impact Wikipedia. I mean, already today, more than half of our page views are on mobile. So that's a big shift, and that's really important. When we think about our vision, which is a free encyclopedia for everyone on the planet in their own language, there's a lot of interesting opportunities and challenges around access to the internet in the developing world as more and more people come online. They're largely coming online for the first time on mobile devices. So we need to think about not just readers on mobile, but editors. How can you contribute to Wikipedia on a device? So those are the kinds of things that I think are really important for the Wikimedia Foundation to think about in the long run, but also to, one of the things the Wikimedia Foundation always has to do is to be very firmly rooted in our community and our values. We're not like a Twitter where we're the company and then there's the users out there and we just try to manage them. It's completely different model. It's like we work for the community, and the community has significant control of a majority of the board are elected by the community and so forth. So we're an interesting organization, but I've always sort of wanted to end up in a place more or less where we are, where the community has this sort of legal existence through the foundation to defend the projects and so on and so forth.
Yeah, definitely. Very interesting to hear about all these different considerations that you had. I know you're very involved in advocating for universal access to information, and that's something you've been very, very enthusiastic about throughout your entire career as well, and something that all of your work with Wikipedia really epitomizes as well. Interesting, and would like to dive a little deeper into what you foresee as the next big developments, or what you feel should be done to work towards this universal access to information. And given the enrichment of available knowledge on the internet through things like Wikipedia now, whether there's the possibility of low-cost education from free resources like this online, and how this will potentially change or shape education methods, especially in places like developing countries in the future.
Yeah, I mean, all of that is near and dear to my heart. I think we're in a really interesting era as that sort of next 2 billion people come online in the next 10 years, because there's an enormous amount of intellectual capacity and talent in the world, and it's underutilized in the sense that if people don't have access to education, then they can be incredibly clever, but they find it very hard to advance their own cultures, to advance society, to advance science, and so forth, without the tools, the intellectual tools, and so forth. That's become, in a completely radical way, incredibly accessible, and it continues to do so. I mean, certainly, universal access to the internet we're not there yet, but we're getting there, and we're getting there not just through top-down initiatives, but just through capitalism, through the ongoing lower and lower cost of access, improvements to technology, higher bandwidth, and so forth. So what we'll see in another 10 or 20 years is ubiquitous access, like something like, I don't know, nearly 100% of the planet has access to radio. We are going to get there for the internet, that if 100% of everyone has some sort of quality access to the internet, which we will get to, that's pretty incredible. And then what we're already seeing is the ability to learn, to get an education through the internet is steadily increasing. What we see around the world is that the amount of formal education is more or less stable. I would say it's slightly increasing every year, but like what percentage of people are finishing a university degree? Okay, well, that does change a little bit, and it's increasing broadly around the world. But what has really exploded is informal learning. So people who aren't part of any sort of a formal program, but they're just learning something. And that can be everything from, I heard something in the news about, something in, I always choose Azerbaijan because I think most people sort of know where Azerbaijan is, but don't know that much about it. And so if you hear something's happened in Azerbaijan, well, 50 years ago, you would have thought, I sort of know where that is, but I don't know much about it. Now people do. They go on the internet, they read the Wikipedia entry, right? They learn about that place and they know more about the world. Now, Wikipedia is not designed to be coursework. And so I think that's important to note, right? You would be a pretty extraordinary learner if you could just start with Wikipedia and learn quantum mechanics, right? I just don't think that's necessarily feasible, sort of advanced mathematics. Although we have incredible coverage of advanced mathematics, it's not laid out as an instructional, it's just not laid out in the right way to sort of train you to that point. It's an encyclopedia, it's a reference work. But those things are existing. I mean, there's some incredible things going on like Khan Academy. Certainly, if you want to learn software development in particular, it's incredibly straightforward. I mean, there's sort of 90 trillion billion free things on YouTube, but also there's paid resources, things like Udemy, where you can go, okay, I'm going to take a course in JavaScript, right? And I'm going to have this wonderful instructor. I'm going to work through it at my own pace, and it's step by step. And at the end of it, I'm going to know JavaScript. That's already exists for fairly low cost, and that's kind of incredible. And I think that's going to be true for loads and loads of things. It's not yet true for a lot of things. Obviously, that would come first for certain kind of very practical things. So, it's very practical. If you don't have a college degree and you say, okay, I'd like to earn more money, okay, you could probably get online and become a pretty decent coder. Probably not necessarily, unless you're very, very clever, someone who's pushing the bounds of computer science, but a perfectly competent coder, you could learn that online in a year or two. And people are doing that. So that's because it's so practical, that comes first, right? People are like, oh, I want to do that. But there's a lot of things that are not particularly practical that you can already do online. I mean, certainly I watched half of an Oxford University course on English history because I had moved to England. And one of the criticisms of that type of online learning is, well, a lot of people don't finish. You know what? I didn't finish the course, but so what? Like, I'm not trying to get a degree in English history. I wanted to learn some things, and I had fun, and I listened to 8 lectures, and that was free, and it was super easy and accessible. And so I think we'll see a lot more of that sort of thing, where you could really become an expert in anything you want to become, not just using Wikipedia, but using all kinds of online free courses. And this is increasingly possible, and it's increasingly happening. And I think that's incredible. And it's particularly incredible once we start to think about people and areas of the world where basically it's completely unthinkable and impossible. Like, how would you possibly ever do that? And now it begins to be possible for anyone to do that.
Yeah, definitely. More and more people are taking the online courses because of the pandemic. So what has this pandemic taught you about flexibility, and both in your life and for the company in the whole?
Well, I mean, sort of from a practical level, my work has been quite virtual for a long time. And so that was no surprise to me. I think for a lot of people, I think we are going to see some long-term transformations in society. I think a lot of companies are now saying, we're probably not going to go back to 5 days a week in the office. We're probably going to do 2 or 3 days a week in the office, and very flexible working schedules. And that's been, that's been a trend for a long time, because it's quite important for, people with families and, you know, uh, different kinds of work environments to be able to work flexible hours and to work from home. And now that's become the norm. Like, everybody understands that. And so I think that's huge. And I think the implications of that, I think it's actually very hard to think about. For example, I live in London. I used to take the tube to, the underground to work every day. Now the thought of that is just absolutely disgusting. Packed in with people breathing in my face, like that. Why would I ever do that again? And I think a lot of people are feeling that way, and a lot of people are feeling it's really not necessary. Like, why would I go traveling with people breathing on me, to sit in an office with people who are breathing on me, when what we're doing, we meet and we chat, and we can do it on Zoom, and we can just live in our nice neighborhood and not have to go through the hell of commuting. Like, that's pretty common, and I think that's going to have a big impact on society. And what does it mean for, for example, London office real estate prices? What does it mean for people actually working from unusual places, right? Why would you want to live in a place that's really, really expensive if you can get a much nicer house somewhere more remote? So I think that those kinds of things, it's going to take a long time for us to really understand how big of an impact this is going to be, as people have learned a different way of living through the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. We are sort of running short a little bit on time, and we would like to fit in a few audience questions if possible. So sort of want to ask one last wrap-up question to end this moderated section of the session before we move to some audience questions. But again, you've been at the forefront of quite an incredible industry throughout your career and have accomplished a great deal. Do you have any new or upcoming goals for the next 5-10 years, or where you see Wikipedia going, where you see yourself going in the next decade? Yeah.
Sure. I mean, yeah, let me talk a bit more broadly about sort of beyond Wikipedia. So I've got the for-profit company Fandom, which has hundreds of thousands of wiki communities mainly on pop culture. So TV shows, video games. You probably, if you watched Game of Thrones and you got confused, you probably ended up on the Game of Thrones wiki and so forth. And that company is doing incredibly well, probably in the top 20 of all websites, and revenue is very, very strong. And that's all exciting because it's enabling us to build new tools for our community creators and so on and so forth. So that's done really well. I've got a pilot project called WT Social, which is a new kind of collaborative social networking platform where every post can be edited. That's still very much in the experimental phase, and we are sort of constantly looking at the software and talking to the community and thinking about how to improve it. That's an ongoing kind of effort that I think a lot about. And then I've always got something fun cooking, and so we're just launching very, very soon quiznightbeyond.com. So this is where you can come and in a kind of a Zoom style, like we're here on the Zoom, but instead of just being sort of a conference, in the middle is like a fun quiz, and it's a competition. And so it's a game. So it's online game for people who are remote to see each other and play and laugh with your friends and so on. So that's launching very soon in partnership with Fandom. So that's kind of a fun side project, but I think it could be quite fun. I hope people enjoy it. And that's kind of the way I am. I mean, as I say, I get up every day and just try to do something I find interesting. And so, well, yeah, during the pandemic, I suddenly found myself sitting at home a lot, whereas I used to travel all the time and give speeches and so forth. And so when I was talking about how it's possible to learn JavaScript from an online course, that's what I did. So I have personal experience that you can do it. And that's just me. Like, I like to do interesting things, interesting projects. And I think when I think about myself in the next 10 years, I think I'll still be actively involved in Wikipedia. You know, I'm on the board of the WikiMedia Foundation. I'm involved in the community, but I'll probably also build, you know, 5 more things. And this is important, half of them will fail. And I'm okay with that, right? Because I'm just like, I hope everything I make I hope it succeeds, but my purpose isn't to succeed. My purpose is to build something that I like. And if other people like it, that's great. And if they don't, okay, whatever, that's fine. I had fun building it, so.
So now let's move on to some audience questions, okay?
Yep.
One of it is, what does Wikipedia plan to bar misinformation and disinformation? And does it ought to reclaim reliability, since, you know, everyone can edit?
Yeah, so the Wikipedia community is quite fierce about the concept of reliable sources and getting it right. And so this is one of the ways that we are completely different from most social media. Most social media is really optimized around engagement. It's optimized to say, you know, like the algorithms at Facebook and Twitter are really, you know, whatever people engage with gets promoted. And what people engage with may or may not be actually true. It's really optimized for keeping you on the site longer, viewing more ads and so forth. Wikipedia is completely different, and our community is very, very focused on seeking the truth. And in an open model, I think that's the only way, ultimately, if you really step back from, as I said, website design into community design and so forth, there's only one way to get to the truth, and that is to have a thoughtful dialogue, people chewing on ideas and so on and so forth. So for us, the biggest challenges around that have been really the rise of low quality media and the decline in the quality of even quality media means that you know, it's a challenge. I'll just give one example. Local newspapers all around the world, local newspapers have been really devastated. And what this means is that, you know, if you want to write the history of a small town in, I'll say, Indiana, since Angela's from Indiana, that's harder to do about the last 5 years than it is about 25 years ago, because 25 years ago, now that's not being done at all. And that's a real problem, that the source material has declined. But, you know, I think the key elements of Wikipedia is the openness is not, you know, it's like, keep an open mind, but not so open that your brain falls out, right? It's really about saying, get quality people to think things through. Of course, people come to Wikipedia sometimes with an agenda, but they find it very difficult because the Wikipedians really don't put up with that kind of POV pushing, point of view pushing, we call it. And instead, it's like, okay, what's your source? How do we know this is true? And this is why, for example, through the pandemic, you can say, you know, Wikipedia is something I'm very proud of, that people can turn to Wikipedia to think about and to learn about the safety and efficacy of vaccines, and they're going to get really good information. It's going to be realistic. It's not propaganda. It's not pushing any particular perspective, but it really will analyze the data and will sort of give you the summary of the best information available. And this is against a backdrop of, you know, viral misinformation being really rampant on the internet. And so that's really important to me.
Right, absolutely. And I guess one final question. We received many questions. Wish we could get to all of them, but we do have limited time with you today, unfortunately. I guess one final question that a lot of people have been asking is biggest life lessons, things along those lines, biggest challenges, overall life lessons from your entire career. I know we've touched on this idea of going for it, like being unafraid of failure and things like that. Any other words you would like to add to that, to send off our delegates today? Many of them are young individuals. Just any words of advice for people first starting out their careers?
Well, yeah, I mean, definitely, while acknowledging that there's certain things you have to do that aren't very fun, and they're just, you've got to tick certain boxes on forms and all of that, and that's fine. But for me, far more important is do something that you think is interesting and fun. And I say both of those, right? Because if I just said, go do something that's fun, that's probably, I don't know, go dance and have a drink with your friends, perfectly fine to do that, but that's not a career. It's really to say something interesting, right? So that you get up every morning and your first thoughts are about the project you're working on, not because you're afraid of a deadline or afraid of failure, but because it's interesting to work on. That you just think, oh, that's actually, like, how would I solve that problem? Let me think about that. And I wake up and I think, okay, I've got this idea. I'm going to try that today, and so on. Because if you don't have that, if you don't find your work interesting, then what's the point, right? It's not, you're not going to be good at it. And by the way, I take a very wide-ranging view of what that might be. So, you can think in terms of, I'm very interested and I'm very inspired by the idea of curing this particular type of cancer, and that's a grand big vision and all that. Okay, that's good. Yeah, nothing wrong with that. But you can also be sort of really inspired and say, look, I actually, something that might not sound that grand to other people, right? I'm working on this really interesting sort of new database. This is for me, and it's like, oh, how would I model data in a non-relational database to do this sort of thing? That's the sort of, I'm a geek, so that's the sort of thing I wake up thinking about. I'm like, oh, that's actually very interesting. How would you do that? And yeah, that's not an inspiring goal about saving the planet, but it's something I find interesting. And so you've got to have that in your life. If you're not interested, then you should begin to think about, how do I get out of this boring stuff and do something I find interesting? And you might not make as much money, or you might be surprise yourself and make a lot more money because you're actually good at it, because you're actually interested in it. So that's my advice to young people.
Yeah, definitely. I think we all should find something that are interesting for us. Thank you so much, Jimmy, for giving us such an inspiring speech. We get into more about your opinions towards the challenges, the core of Wikipedia, and so on. Really enjoy your sharing.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.